Jean-Martin, thanks so much for being with us. The World Food Programme recently released its 2026 Global Outlook on Food Security. It's entitled Hunger and Hope, Innovative Solutions to Address Food Insecurity. And looking at some of the headlines of this report, up to 720 million people worldwide are facing chronic hunger. That means 1 in 11 people do not have enough food to lead a healthy, active lifestyle. 318 million people are facing extreme hunger. These are startling figures. What is your assessment of the global food security situation right now?
We are in a deepening crisis. We're in a crisis that's marked by the numbers you've mentioned. I'd like to emphasize that the number of acutely food insecure people has more than doubled since the pandemic. And in fact, we're seeing an increase also in the most extreme situations, situations of starvation, situations of people living famine-like conditions. Those affect about 1 million people around the world. And right now, for the first time this century, we have 2 concurrent famines, one in Gaza and one in Sudan. The situation is very bad. The situation is bleak because the needs are quite high, and we're also facing unprecedented cuts to humanitarian funding.
Now, you say the number of people who are going hungry has doubled since the pandemic. What's changed? What's causing that?
Well, there's been, of course, the cost of living crisis that took place in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis. That's been economic factors have been a baseline there. But what's really driven these increases is conflict. Conflict in places like, I mentioned Sudan, I mentioned Palestine, but there's also been conflict around the world. In fact, the number of conflicts has been increasing, and that drives displacement. Conflict destroys food systems, and it makes it more difficult for people to meet their own needs. That's why today we've got more than 300 million people acutely food insecure. Conflict also makes it harder for humanitarians like the World Food Programme to come in and provide assistance. Low access and barriers to humanitarian access are also a factor behind the reemergence of very severe forms of food insecurity around the world.
Now, all those drivers that you've mentioned, things like the famine in Sudan, in Gaza, as well as the situation that's causing food shortages from the Ukraine conflict, those are all man-made situations. These are not natural disasters or anything like that. So what can be done? I mean, how much of an effort is going to be needed by the entire world to address these crises?
Well, 2/3 of the 318 million people facing acute food insecurity are in these crisis settings. And you said it, these are man-made crises. What man has created, man can resolve. And what we need is action at the diplomatic level to resolve these crises. And as long as these wars continue, as long as these conflicts go on, we need to make sure that humanitarians have access to people in need, that we're not prevented from providing essential assistance to women and children suffering from hunger and malnutrition. This needs to be a bigger part of the international conversation about who we are. We need to make sure that humanitarian norms are respected all over the world.
To what extent is climate change contributing to food insecurity right now?
Well, climate change is a factor that's always been there. And we're seeing that there are more events that are leading to food insecurity. The example of Hurricane Melissa in the Caribbean is perhaps an example of what's to come. That storm was a tropical storm and turned into a hurricane in just 48 hours. That's a Category 5 hurricane in 48 hours. That's an unprecedented pace of strengthening. And it created a storm that reached records in terms of magnitude and caused utter devastation in parts of Jamaica, Cuba, and Haiti. This means that on the horizon, as we look ahead to the future, climatic factors are extremely important. I'd also like to add that in Somalia right now, the country is facing a case of drought driven in part by La Nina, another climate phenomenon. So climatic factors are interacting with economic and political factors on the ground to drive food insecurity.
Now, of course, there have to be long-term planning, long-term solutions to address this crisis. But what can be done in the short term? Are there things like food vouchers that could help?
Well, of course, there is the emergency response can to the extent possible, should be based on cash, on vouchers, mechanisms that support the local economy. But what we are trying to do as much as possible is intervene before a disaster hits. We know that intervening before a disaster hits has large economic benefits. A dollar spent in advance of a crisis averts $7 of damage after a crisis. So by being proactive, by being agile, we're able to help people and help our limited budgets go that much further.
Right, and how much of a driver is political instability? Because we've talked about, crises that involve high levels of violence, but political instability, to what extent does that drive this?
Well, conflict and fragility are there. They are factors behind the food insecurity we're seeing worldwide. It's actually quite difficult to not just to classify a crisis into and put it into a box. When we see a crisis, for example, in Haiti, which is one of the hunger hotspots in the world, well, there's definitely violence, but there are also political factors, there are long-term environmental factors, and huge risk to things like hurricanes. So what we're looking at more often are what we call polycrises, crises that are made up of very different elements, and we need to have a very holistic approach in responding to these crises.
Now, how can modern technology, and we've got some very advanced technologies available right now, things like AI, things like data analysis, etc. How can that help? I mean, what is the methodology that you are using? I understand that you also helped develop the agency's cell phone survey methodology, which uses data to give you a better picture of what the situation is like.
Well, Anand, I was explaining that when we're able to act early, we're able to act more efficiently. And that early action relies on data. And being able to source data in real time from the world's crisis centers, that allows us to target people with assistance that can be delivered quite quickly. I mentioned the case of Hurricane Melissa. When Melissa was a tropical storm, the authorities in Haiti were able to unleash anticipatory payments, and these payments were made to about 9,000 households in the south of Haiti. They received about $100 per household to help prepare for the storm and therefore avert disaster down the line. These types of early payments, what we call anticipatory action in the humanitarian space, is a very good example of how you leverage data to make a difference, because this is data-driven and we use mobile money, mobile technology to get resources to people who are in a situation of vulnerability. This is what the future looks like. Artificial intelligence can also help us understand what's going on in remote communities all over the world, including those that are affected by conflict and that are hard to reach. Your viewers might want to check out the Hunger Map Live. It's a live WFP tool that brings in data streams on the rainfall, vegetation, economic factors such as food prices, but also recent surveys that we've done by mobile to predict the scale of food insecurity at the highly local level. These are great examples of how humanitarian assistance can become more effective and more sensitive to constraints as they evolve in real time.
Of course, the goal is to bring the number down to zero. There is one country that's had enormous success in alleviating poverty, and that includes hunger, and that is China. It's managed to bring the number of people living in poverty and extreme poverty to zero. Can the Chinese model be emulated elsewhere?
I think what we're seeing internationally is that there are conflicts that are not resolved, and there are situations of violence that are not resolved. And 2/3 of the number that we mentioned earlier on in the interview, 380 million people in acute food insecurity, that will not be resolved as long as there's conflict, as long as people are being driven from their homes, and as long as food systems are being undermined by conflict. So, of course, for each country will have its solutions and its approaches to reducing hunger. We need to invest more in peacetime. But what the situation today is crying out for is for peace, is for stability, is for people who ask nothing more. People don't want humanitarian assistance. They want to be able to tend their farms, to tend to their own life and succeed with their families. And that's what we need to do is end these conflicts.
Jean-Martin Bauer, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.